Okay, it's good afternoon now, Tanakoto. Okay, so I want to talk about research data management for research programs. I'll explain what a research program is in a second, since on a number of occasions I've tried to talk about this and there was some confusion. But my biggest problem really is I've been working in this space of being either on research programs or advising on them, and discovering that there really isn't any good practices out there for helping people manage data on research programs. So, okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what a research program is, why it's research data management is important, and then I'm going to talk about some observations myself and my colleague, Jude, who unfortunately couldn't be here, have noted, but we're not the only ones to have noted some of these issues, and then try and end up with some recommendations. And the recommendations are really going to be around plan up front how you're going to manage your data on the research programs. Don't try to retrofit it, which is what we've been, a couple of occasions, been asked to do. Yep, so I'd like to thank all these people. I'm not going to actually name the research programs where we pulled some of this out from, some of our findings from, because I did that in Australia and it didn't go down very well. So, what do I mean by a research program? What I mean basically is something that's mission orientated, it's got a strategic objectives, it's going to run for multiple years, 5 to 10 years. It's often got and this is the key thing, it's often got a whole set of interconnected projects. Some of them will start together, but they will build on each other. There are dependencies, data dependencies between the projects. There are synergies, and generally that by bringing the data and the research together across these projects, you're going to have more impact than if you're doing a single project on its own. They're typically multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, multiple partners, potentially quite a few people that are outside academia or research institutes. You're trying to use resources and data across institutions. They often have complex funding arrangements. There might be in-kind funding or money that's actually been provided by the institutes as well as the main funder. They tend to have some central management and governance. There's often a kind of operations team or a management team sitting across the whole of the program. And generally, as probably people who have involved in this, it has a high administrative overhead and you never budget enough for that. So that's what I mean by a research program. So why is research data important in that context? Well, firstly, obviously, you've got to meet the funders' requirements around what they're expecting to do with data management, and that's quite variable. I mean, if you're involved in things like Horizon Europe's programs, then the data management requirements are quite high. One of the things, though, you're really doing is you want to leverage off the data that you're generating in the program on each of the projects. And so you want to ensure that the data can be shared and integrated across the different projects. An aspect of that is transparency and trust. Everybody in the program needs to be able to trust the other people working on the other projects, that the data they're producing is going to have followed some good data management practices. And that also applies to the partners and stakeholders. If the partners or stakeholders are bringing data into the program, whether that be industry, government, or maybe indigenous groups, they want to know that the data is going to be managed across the program and that there's transparency and trust around that data management. If you've got good data management practices in place across the program, then that saves time and resources. I mean, you can get data reuse across the program. You can do things like negotiate agreed access to licensed data for the whole program rather than for one particular project. You're looking to try and mitigate the risks, particularly data loss. These programs are going on for a long time, and the thing you don't want to happen is that you're losing, you get to year 6 and the data from year 1 has disappeared somewhere. If you can do all this around research data management, then you can start to get higher levels of reuse. You can be publishing the data. That allows you to have more citations of the research and the data. That increases the program's visibility, and therefore you're having more impact. And finally, most people are interested to actually make sure that the data that's being collected in the program since it costs money to do that, is available for onward use. And so you're looking for some way of actually being able to make that data available in the future. So my view is that there's some kind of unique complexities and challenges around research data management for programs. Back in 2016, a group of us were asked to advise on a New Zealand program around data management, and we really struggled to find anything out there to actually give us any guidance on this. When I got involved in another program in 2020 in Australia, I'd hoped that things had improved, but we were still quite challenged to find anything useful to help this particular program we were working on to actually what would be good practice and what it needed to do around data management. So there's lots of advice out there around research data management frameworks for institutions and for projects, but as I say, we couldn't really find anything around research programs. So my view, my colleagues' view, and some colleagues that we've worked with in Australia on this is that there's a significant knowledge gap. And one of the things that we're particularly conscious of, and one of the things that's come out of some of the programs we've been involved in and looked at, is that there is a real concern that the work that's done and the data that's generated is actually lost at the end of the projects, or at the end of the programs, rather. So this is the only framework I've sort of been able to find in my time that I've been looking for it. This was some work done in Switzerland, looking at their research program funding, where somebody actually tried to establish what a kind of model looks like. And you've obviously got things like setup stages, making decisions around projects you're going to fund, then there's project activity, and then there's the outputs from the project. You've got project support, and you've got then an overarching management group that's kind of navigating the whole program. When we ran a workshop last year, which I'm going to briefly talk about, we tried to get the people at the workshop to sort of put a research data management lens on this, and people unfortunately really struggled, so we haven't really made much progress in that. Okay, so what do we know and what have we seen? So I said there's not much out there in the literature, so my observations are basically, or my colleagues' observations as well, are based on conversations that we had in Australia and also some of the peers in Europe. It's based on the programs we've been involved in. So we've looked across programs like the National Science Challenges and the CRCs in Australia. We've looked across a diverse range of fields. And as I mentioned, we also ran this workshop last October with data managers, research support officers, and critically we had program leaders trying to sort of look at this and see what was going on and see what recommendations we could come up with. Okay, so here's some of the challenges. First one is leadership and governance. Basically, there's limited understanding by people running these programs around research data management. And there's low recognition of how important it is for the success of the project. When we've gone in and started to talk to the program leaders around putting research data management in, they've sort of like rabbits in headlights, example, this is really complicated, we didn't fund this, and we're overwhelmed and we don't know what to do. The data governance is often lacking. There's no real data champions in the leadership team. Typically, there's no actual funding for research data management. There are collaboration and execution issues. There's nothing really in the collaboration agreements about how the institutions that are participating are going to handle data management and what the responsibilities are. And this lack of early planning really harms the research collaborations and outcomes from what we can see. And as I mentioned, what's happened on a couple of occasions is we've been brought in to try and retrofit frameworks and strategies, and you really can't do it. It's too late. You know, the whole program's up and running. Suddenly we've been told, can we put some data governance in? Well, it's really difficult. Can we put some training in place around research data management? Well, yes, we can, but you haven't got any framework to operate in. Then there are issues around the institutions and people. So there's a lot of variability in research data management maturity between researchers. Some are quite knowledgeable, others are not. Between the stakeholders and also between the institutions. We did find out that PhD students, particularly in Australia, were much more receptive to the importance of research data management than their colleagues, senior colleagues were and their project managers. There's often a low level of expertise, something that was mentioned earlier. There's a lack of willingness to actually share data between the projects. There are whole issues around IP, and that has to all be sorted before you can actually start sharing data around. We discovered that you can have an imbalance. You know, some institutions are well-resourced around data management and providing a lot of support. Some have very little. And the roles and responsibilities and accountabilities are often not defined, and particularly where they should be located. You know, what's the responsibility of the program? What's the responsibility of a project? Around tools, there's lots of challenges around data sharing and interoperability. There's often no common systems. There's issues around, well, what tools and facilities are you going to provide and who's going to provide them? Is it the responsibility of a single institution that takes on that for the whole program? Is it each researcher's institution? Do you need a dedicated program infrastructure? We discovered all sorts of issues around managing access to sensitive data when you're going across institutions. And towards the end of the program, the program's leadership discover they got a real issue around trying to work out how they're going to sustain a data infrastructure, even just if they put up a repository. And that makes it really difficult to ensure the data remains available and usable. There are also issues around processes and policies and practices. Institutions will have them, the program will want them, there might be requirements around this from the funders. Who wins? And we actually ran into some challenges of institutions saying, no, you have to follow my processes because the researchers are in my institution. We did find that some disciplines are much better at this than others, health in particular. They seem to be much more mature data management practices. There are challenges around stakeholder alignment issues. Not all the stakeholders themselves that you could be working in, if you're working in like with industry and so on, they're not necessarily that particularly aware of research data management, and you're having to actually bring them up to speed around how to manage data. You can get conflicts over data use policies, and coordinating risk mitigation, data loss across all the partners can be really difficult. So, a quick case study. So in the SOAR CRC, we were asked if we could look at, towards the end of the program, they were saying, where are we going to put the data? We suggested you put it in, that they put it into the institutional repositories. So we did a quick survey of 8 universities and some partners around the ability for, where could the data be put at the end of the program? While they were able to handle quite a wide variety of SOAR data, some cases there was no repository. There were all sorts of issues about which one should it go into, and if you go to a particular institution, was that institution willing to take the data from another partner or a third-party organisation, like an industry body or so on? And most of the institutions said, no, hold on, we don't really do that. We only take data from our researchers. There was concerns over commercial sensitivity and confidentiality agreements, particularly if you're bringing in data that's come from a commercial partner. So we proposed and said, well, okay, if your data's going to go into these repositories, can we put a sort of virtual catalogue on the top so at least the program can publicise the fact that this data exists in these repositories? We found that was going to be really hard. A lot of the universities didn't actually have their API set up properly to do that. They didn't really have a way of tagging the source data that was going into the repositories being from the SOAR CRC. And generally there was a reticence about doing that, mainly because of the problems further up on this slide. So it's a challenging space. So I'm going to finish with 2 slides. I think that the key thing really is you've got to be planning for this up front, right? You can't, as I say, halfway through the program say, oh, we now need to sort the data management issues out. You can't, it's not a reactive thing. You have to be proactive around this. So it's really important that you do actually plan right at the grant application stage. How are you going to be handling the data in the program? Ideally, you really should be engaging some of the key researchers around what's critical for them for the program to be successful. You need to determine what the funders and institutional requirements are, particularly around your external stakeholders. What are their expectations? The next one, this is really tough because generally there isn't a budget line for research data management when you go after funding, but you do really need to cost it up. How much is it going to actually cost to get the basic research data management infrastructure in place or framework? Conduct an audit of those that are going to be involved. Do they have some tools that you can actually use right from the start? And make sure you include some funding for the data managers, the support people, and to provide training to your researchers. You need a research data management strategy. You need to decide on a governance framework and define roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities, both for the program and for projects. Have a data management policy right up front and decide on the data culture that you actually want across the program. One of the things we found in the CRC project is that we needed to actually bring everybody up to at least a base level. So when you were having conversations around research data management with project managers and even the governance board, they knew what you were talking about. And finally, rather surprisingly, really, I guess, collaboration agreements. The contracts are your most powerful tool. Because what we were finding was that because there was nothing in the contracts, the leadership team of the programs had no leverage over the institutions about what they should be doing. So, you need to get something in the contracts to basically saying there are responsibilities on the institution around research data management. Define your IP rights and data ownership right up front, and also say how you're going to monitor compliance and deal with non-compliance. Okay, so that was a quick run through of what we've been trying to get a grip on around research data management in research programs.
Thank you, David. Right, questions or comments?
Can I ask one? Has anybody found anything in this space? Because we've really struggled. Yeah, is that an answer? There is a paper by eResearch on this.
Yeah, there's also quite a significant framework report that came out of Consul in 2016. I'm really happy to share it with you. We found very much the same sort of thing. I say we because I chaired a group of 8 university librarians talking about this 10 years ago. It's simultaneously encouraging to know that your findings are very similar. It's very disheartening to know that we haven't really moved very far from it. But I'll happily share it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I would comment actually that comparing what Bridget talked about and what you did, the thing that really stood out to me was the buy-in from the leadership, right? Yeah. You talked, Bridget, about the science leader, and then David, you sort of said that at one point that you thought that was one of the places where there were issues that could be improved. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge. It's really difficult.
Well, it comes down because if you get the leadership buy-in, then it solves a lot of the problems around resourcing and things like that, as well as setting culture and a bunch of other things.
I think just related to that leadership question, one of the challenges that my institution is that at leadership they're talking about data strategy, but they're not talking about research data. They're lumping in research data with all of our other data. So, student data, finance data, HR, and I'm just kind of banging my head against a wall saying this is completely different.
Yeah. I mean, I think the funders have got a role here to actually say at the end of the programs, what have you done with the data? Where is it available? And I don't think they do. They just kind of move on to the next piece of funded work.
It better be fast, Mick.
Pretty fast. So does that mean we need a national infrastructure around research data management?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so national infrastructure around research data management. Good, okay. Thank you.